The Super-class Star Destroyer is one of the most infamous ship designs in the entire Star Wars franchise. These massive ships are practically mobile space stations because of their sheer enormity. Most of them are at least 15,000 meters long with insane crew complements of 50,000 or more. However, the term Super Star Destroyer isn't an official designation in canon, but a general term for these enormous ships. Most of these Super Star Destroyers are actually officially Star Dreadnoughts, according to the Anaxi's rating system. Any ship over 5,000 meters in length could fit into this category, although we wouldn't think of all these as Super Star Destroyers. In this video, we're going to look at every major Super Star Destroyer variant in canon and Legends. Let's get started. The Executor class Star Dreadnought is the definitive Super Star Destroyer. We first see this iconic ship in The Empire Strikes Back. In the Legends continuity, Darth Vader used the first of this line of massive ships as his flagship, and it was also called the Executor. Originally, during the production of Episode 5, the Executor was just meant to be another faster Star Destroyer, but gradually it evolved into a much larger ship than the ISDs that served as its escort. However, in canon, the first Super Star Destroyer was actually the Annihilator, which was Grand General Cassio Tag's flagship. We know from the Star Wars databank that this notorious capital ship's designer was Lyra Wessex. Kuat Drive Yards constructed them while Fondor Shipyards added some finishing touches, including a variant of the class that possessed cloaking abilities. During their heyday, they were the largest ships in the galaxy and were seen as almost invincible in combat. They were 12 times larger than a standard Imperial Star Destroyer at 19,000 meters, but retained the distinctive Star Destroyer wedge-shaped profile. Canon explicitly states that the Empire built 13 of these vast ships, but Legends intentionally left the total ambiguous, with an estimate of between 20 and 25. Lyra Wessex was the original designer of the Executor-class Star Dreadnought. She already had the designs of the Clone Wars Stalwart, the Venator-class, and the Imperator-class Star Destroyers on her resume. Wessex believed in Kuat Drive Yard's preference for terror styling, which basically meant that the size of Star Destroyers was largely responsible for their ability to intimidate enemies. This correlated with the Tarkin Doctrine, the Imperial philosophy which emphasized the use of fear as a deterrent against potential resistance. This was why the Imperials used AT-ATs instead of the more stable six-legged AT-TE design of the Clone Wars era, because they were more physically imposing. The Death Star was set to be the ultimate expression of the Tarkin Doctrine because who would rebel if they thought their penalty would be the total destruction of their planet? Emperor Palpatine recognized the value of Executor-class Star Destroyers as an intimidating tool and authorized their construction before the Battle of Yavin. However, at the time, the Imperials still had to slip the design past the Senate Oversight Committees. Budget oversight was one of the few remaining tools that belligerent galactic senators could still use to hinder Palpatine's ambitions. The Imperial Navy hid the details of the new ship by calling it a super-class Star Destroyer and understated its true length by thousands of kilometers. According to Star Wars Complete Locations, this was how the ship came to have its iconic nickname, the Super-class Star Destroyer. But only one of the many Super Star Destroyer variants in canon and Legends actually carries this as an official designation. After the destruction of the first Death Star, the Empire pushed the construction of the Executor, Darth Vader's future flagship, to compensate for the loss of the battle station. The ship would serve as a symbol of intimidation, at least until the construction of the second Death Star. In the X-Wing series, we learned that the second ship of this line was built simultaneously alongside the Executor. This was the Lusankya, although at the time it was designated the Executor II. Eventually it was hidden on Coruscant, which might seem crazy for a 19,000 meter ship, but that's exactly what they did. I mentioned earlier that in canon, General Tag got his hands on the first Super Star Destroyer, the Annihilator. He was a fierce critic of the Death Star, believing that the Empire could just produce countless Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts instead of blowing enormous resources on the battle station. Ironically, he lost his own ship to pirates and almost allowed the rogue scientist Silo to commandeer the Executor. Eventually, the Emperor gave command of the ship and the fleet to Darth Vader, who promptly executed Tag for his failings. Well, the General has been making additions to his collection for several years now, and if you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it could be like to own a saber yourself. So that's why I started my own store called Stickman Sabers, with a singular goal in mind: Make sabers that look amazing, being inspired by iconic designs but specifically built to actually duel with. No worrying about babying them, just pick them up and go ham. They're equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there. And obviously have that iconic hum, just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick a collector's saber up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. So, if you ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start. Links in the description, and now, let's get back to the video. Let's talk about the specifications of these vast ships next. According to Starships and Speeders, each of these Super Star Destroyers had 13 Executor 50X engines and a Class 1 hyperdrive. Their armament was ridiculous, with over 5,000 turbo lasers, including 750 heavy turbo lasers and 1,000 turret-mounted light turbo lasers. Meanwhile, the Executor class also had 124 concussion missile launchers, 100 twin battleship ion cannons, and 250 turret-mounted quad laser cannons. They carried a complement of over 1,000 starships, including 144 TIE Series starfighters, divided into 12 squadrons. Other ships included 200 assault shuttles, transport shuttles, support craft, and Y-85 Titan dropships. A typical ground complement included 24 AT-ATs, 50 AT-STs, and 2 IM-455 modular garrisons. These vast starships had a crew of 280,074, as well as 38,000 troops and support staff. The Executor's destruction in Episode 6 at the Battle of Endor was a major blow because the Empire lost many of its best and brightest. It possessed long-range sensors and enough consumables for 6 years without resupply. One major flaw was the bridge, which stuck out like an Imperial Star Destroyer. The bridge was 285 meters wide and contained shield generators, briefing rooms, and escape pods, as well as the command center. However, we see how a single A-Wing's kamikaze run destroyed it because it was so exposed. Inbuilt bridges were one aspect of the First Order Resurgent class Star Destroyer that really made sense. Before moving on to our next Super Star Destroyer variant, I want to mention what happened to some of the most notorious Executor class Star Dreadnoughts in canon and legends. In canon, the Ravager was only known Executor class remaining in Imperial service after the destruction of Vader's flagship. The novel Aftermath Life Debt reveals that it was the flagship of Grand Admiral Ray Sloane. She disappeared during the attack on Chandrila, so it fell into the hands of Fleet Admiral Gallius Rax, who used it at the Battle of Jakku. The ship was caught in a gravity well and crashed into the sands of the desert planet. It was a different story in the old expanded universe because there were several more Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts in Imperial service. Palpatine tasked the Guardian with protecting Coruscant, while the Annihilator was stationed close to Kuat. At least one Super Star Destroyer, the Terror, had cloaking capability. Admiral Ginge received the Brawl as his flagship, but he renamed it the Iron Fist after his first command. He used it throughout his campaign of terror against the fledgling New Republic. Another notable Super Star Destroyer was the Night Hammer, which features in Kevin J. Anderson's Jedi Academy trilogy. Commissioned at great expense by the self-titled superior General Sander Delvardis, it was eventually taken by Admiral Natasi Dalla. She used it to attack Luke Skywalker's Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4 before it was destroyed by the Jedi Callista Ming. The Lusankya was perhaps the second most infamous Executor-class Star Destroyer in Legends after Vader's personal ship. After its construction, the ship was buried under the surface of Coruscant as an emergency escape vehicle for the Empire, which isn't exactly subtle. Isan Isard initially used it as her private prison. Finally, in the Krytos Trap, she activated the massive ship, ripping through Coruscant's skyline and killing millions of civilians. Eventually, the Republic captured and repaired the Lusankya, even using it against the Yuuzhan Vong along with several other Super Star Destroyers. It's worth noting that in canon, there are several confirmed variations of these ships, including the Executor I and Executor II classes, but there's no current information on the differences. There's no doubt that when people say Super Star Destroyer, it's the Executor class that they're thinking about. Next up is the third official Super Star Destroyer variant in canon, the Mandator IV class Siege Dreadnought. Lucasfilm usually avoids using Super Star Destroyer as a formal classification in modern canon. However, reference material explicitly describes this as a Star Dreadnought. while its immense size and its role definitely earn it a spot in this video. In The Last Jedi, Admiral Akbar expresses horror at the sight of the Fulminatrix. In his words, it boasts more firepower than a dozen Star Destroyers, specifically for planetary assault. It is the second shortest ship in this video, it's 7.7 kilometers long, but it's one of the most devastating. Manufactured by Kuat and Trala Engineering, it was used by the First Order during the Cold War against the New Republic and again against the Resistance. The Last Jedi Incredible Cross-Sections reveals the staggering scale and power of these vast ships. They were 2.5 times the size of the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer, the First Order's standard ship of the line. A Mandator IV had a crew of 53,000 officers, 140,000 enlisted personnel, and a further 22,000 stormtroopers. Their primary weapons were 2 massive orbital cannons that could unleash a devastating salvo of 2 rounds each before recharging. These fearsome weapons could scour the entire surface of planets, leaving them devoid of life. According to The Last Jedi Expanded Edition, they could also punch through planetary deflector shields and turn 100 cubic meters of crust into vapor and slag. Other weapons in its armament included 26 dorsal point defense anti-aircraft cannons, as well as 6 tractor beam projectors. The Rise of Skywalker Visual Dictionary explains that the Mandator IV was essentially a test project that informed the Zeiston-class Star Destroyer design. Although it doesn't go into detail about that, the designers likely wanted to try building a ship with insane firepower that doesn't tear itself apart. Each Zeiston class had a miniaturized Death Star laser in what was essentially an Imperial Star Destroyer body. The Mandator IV Siege Dreadnought doesn't actually get much screen time in the original trilogy. Other massive vehicles and superweapons like the Mega-class Star Destroyer and Starkiller Base overshadow it. In Episode 8, the Fulminatrix joined a strike force of 3 Resurgent-class Star Destroyers at the Siege of Dakar. The Fulminatrix destroyed the Resistance base with its overwhelming firepower. Poe Dameron successfully destroyed the cannons with his X-Wing. He led a bombing run of MG-100 Star Fortress SF-17 bombers against the Siege Dreadnought before it could recharge its weapons and obliterate the Resistance fleet. After an intense space battle, the final bomber managed to destroy the Fulminatrix, although it too was fatally damaged in the process. After the Battle of Crate, the First Order also sent a Malachor IV Dreadnought to Naboo, Emperor Palpatine's homeworld. However, before it could devastate the planet, a fleet of Naboo N-1 starfighters, TIE Strikers, and X-Wings engaged it. The Dreadnought lost one of its 2 autocannons, but successfully withdrew before it was critically damaged. In the Allegiance comic book series, the First Order General Armitage Hux used a Mandator IV to destroy the neutral planet Tanuna after discovering a resistance signal there. Snowtroopers also massacred civilians in a city while TIE bombers dropped their payloads on the unfortunate world. The First Order didn't make too many of these daunting capital ships because they became redundant after the Zeiston class entered service. Arguably, they've got more aura, and despite their overwhelming firepower, appear to be more realistic than the First Order superweapon. Let me know in the comments what you think about this awesome ship. Next up is the Mega-class Star Dreadnought, the biggest ship in galactic history. The First Order only constructed one of these enormous beasts, and it's no surprise why. According to The Last Jedi Incredible Cross-Sections, it was over 60 kilometers wide and almost 13 kilometers long. This ship still retained the distinctive Star Destroyer wedge shape, but it was unusual in being wider than it was long. Similarly to the Mandator IV, this ship doesn't quite get the love it deserves. That's mainly because the sequel trilogy threw too many high-powered capital ships at the audience at once, but the Mega-class Star Dreadnought is an unbelievable behemoth. It's essentially a fleet carrier for capital ships because it could carry 6 Resurgent-class Star Destroyers in the aft portion of its wings, as well as 2 more internally. You might be wondering what the point of this is. These internal bays weren't just parking spaces, they also allowed the Star Dreadnought to repair, refit, and resupply the Star Destroyers without returning to a fixed shipyard. This made the First Order way less dependent on planetary infrastructure. In some ways, this actually makes the Mega-class more practical than other Super Star Destroyer variants because it decentralized the First Order's capital and gave them a mobile repair yard. Supreme Leader Snoke used the Supremacy as his flagship, the sole Mega-class Star Dreadnought in the entire First Order fleet. Exegol was the true hidden capital of the First Order and Sith Eternal in the Unknown Regions, but it was too far from the regular galaxy and too critical to use as a forward base. The Supremacy was the perfect solution as the First Order gradually conquered the New Republic. This ship also reflected First Order doctrine because it had far fewer ships than the old Galactic Empire. However, each Resurgent-class Star Destroyer was far more capable than any of the old canon Imperial capital ships, except for the Executor class. They carried much heavier armaments, more troops, and had stronger armor. The Last Jedi Incredible Cross-Section says that the Mega class had a total crew complement of 2,225,000, which is absolutely insane. In the unlikely event that it carried a full capacity of 8 Resurgent-class destroyers with full crews, there would be about 3 million people connected to this monstrous vessel. The Mega class was powered by at least 6 fusion reactor complexes and had around 32 sunlight engines. Other features included a hyperdrive tracker, and a throne room for Supreme Leader Snoke. The shipwrights intended this capital ship to be fully self-sufficient, with onboard foundries, factories, ore processing plants, and 2 shipyards. It was more like an extremely mobile space station than a true Super Star Destroyer, but that's nitpicking. We don't have figures for its weapon systems, but we know that it had heavy turbo lasers, anti-ship missiles, heavy ion cannons, and tractor beam projectors. Again, there are no numbers for the number of starfighters it carried, but each Resurgent class had 2 starfighter wings. The Mega class likely had a similar complement, as well as a large number of military vehicles, including next-generation AT-ATs, AT-STs, and the fearsome First Order all-terrain Mega Caliber 6 Walker. It had more than enough firepower to defend itself in any conventional fight against a Resistance capital ship. It seemed like the Mega class was invincible until a lady with pink hair decided to plow her own ship through the middle of it. That's precisely what Resistance Admiral Holdo did in The Last Jedi when she rammed the Supremacy at light speed with her Mon Calamari heavy cruiser, the Raddus. The Raddus had already suffered extensive damage after an attack by TIE fighters led by Kylo Ren. Most of the Resistance High Command lost their lives, including Admiral Akbar. However, Leia Organa managed to survive, using the Force to return to safety in one of the most polarizing scenes in any Star Wars movie. Admiral Holdo opted to remain behind, commanding the vessel from its secondary bridge. As the Supremacy targeted the Raddus's lifeboats, Holdo turned her ship and rammed the Mega-class Star Destroyer at light speed. She inflicted critical damage on the gigantic vessel while also destroying several of the escorting First Order Resurgent-class Star Destroyers in the process. One of the chief criticisms that fans have of the Mega-class Star Dreadnought is that it created a catastrophic single point of failure. When Holdo destroyed the ship, she eliminated a massive amount of the First Order's command and industrial capability in one strike. Incredibly, one being could have such a devastating effect, but it's reminiscent of Green Leader Arvel Krynid at the Battle of Endor, when he smashed his A-Wing into the bridge of the Executor. Arguably, the problem with the Supremacy wasn't the ship itself as a mobile command center, but how the First Order used it. They should never have put it in frontline combat because it contained so much critical infrastructure. The Supremacy's commanders had too much hubris and arrogance, so they failed to understand the risk they were taking. Essentially, they put their capital city in battle when it was completely unnecessary. They could have just sent a strike force of Resurgent-class destroyers after the rebels instead of joining the slow pursuit. Another key issue that the First Order should have learned from Endor was not to put all your senior command in one target. Real militaries often separate political leadership, fleet command, and logistics precisely to avoid a decapitation strike. This was one of the main reasons why the Empire essentially fractured after the deaths of Palpatine and Vader. Ultimately, this was a writing issue because the Supremacy was written to serve as the climactic setting for The Last Jedi, which required placing nearly all of the First Order's leadership aboard a single ship. From an in-universe military perspective, however, that decision sacrificed strategic prudence for dramatic effect. Ironically, the ship's design itself is genuinely quite sensible. A mobile headquarters and shipyard capable of supporting an expeditionary fleet is a sound concept. The questionable part was not what the Supremacy was, but how the First Order chose to employ it. They treated it as a uniquely valuable strategic asset, as if it were simply the biggest ship in the battle line, which was a massive error of judgment. Next up is the Eclipse I class Dreadnought, one of the most devastating ships ever constructed in the Legends continuity. The Eclipse line was the successor to the Executor class and was the next generation of Super Star Destroyers. It's got arguably the best name of all these ships because of its staggering scale. They appear in the Dark Empire series, with the first Eclipse Star Destroyer serving as the flagship for the reborn Emperor Palpatine. The Dark Empire sourcebook explains that our old friends Quat Drive Yards constructed the initial prototype and lead ship of its class. They used the prototype as a weapons test bed and eventually converted it into a battle station called the Tarkin. Eventually, a rebel sabotage team destroyed the Tarkin as we see in the 1977 Star Wars comic book series. Quat Drive named the first ship of this type the Eclipse. It was technically the biggest Star Destroyer ever built by volume, although it was actually slightly shorter than the Executor class at 17.5 kilometers long. The Essential Guide to Warfare explains that it was encased in a jet black durasteel and quadranium alloyed hull that added to its aura and potency as a psychological weapon. The Eclipse's interior was very similar to that of a standard Star Destroyer. However, its vast scale allowed it additional features like repair facilities and docking bays similar to those on a space station. These Legend ships definitely provided some inspiration for the First Order Mega-class Star Dreadnought in the current canon, as did the story of the reborn Emperor in his clone body. Meanwhile, its hangars were large enough to contain a Victory-class Star Destroyer. However, in practice, they loaded up with 50 squadrons of 600 TIE interceptors and 8 TIE bomber squadrons. That's almost 700 starfighters in total, which was powerful enough to take on any New Republic force. Ground vehicles and resources included 100 AT-ATs and 5 prefabricated garrison bases. Meanwhile, the Dark Empire sourcebook explains that it had a crew complement of 708,470, but could run on a skeleton crew of 88,500. Just for comparison, that's still more than twice the crew requirement of an Imperial Star Destroyer. They carried 10 years' worth of consumables and had a staggering cargo capacity of 600,000 tons. The Empire designed these massive Super Star Destroyers to be totally self-sufficient. Interestingly, it had a Class 2.0 hyperdrive rating, despite apparently having an enhanced hyperdrive system. But that was a lot of mass to move. The Eclipse possessed devastating firepower. Let's run through its conventional weapons systems first. The designers outfitted it with 550 heavy laser cannons, 500 turbo lasers, and 75 ion cannons. It also possessed 10 gravity well projectors, so it had interdiction capabilities that prevented enemies from jumping to hyperspace. The ship had enhanced shields as well as 100 tractor beams. The unique hull design gave it the unique ability to ram enemies without sustaining major damage to the hull, like a trireme from antiquity in the real world. Also, the new Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels explains that it had an exceptionally powerful communication system. Interestingly, it had an asymmetrical bridge tower design with the main sensor array on the other side of the bridge from the communications array. Meanwhile, the deflector shield command was placed on top of the bridge tower. But the most important aspect of the Eclipse was its devastating super laser. This gave it the equivalent of an entire planet's worth of weaponry. This concealed super laser ran the entire length of the ship's spine. The designers based it on the Death Star, and it had about 2/3 of the power of the notorious superweapon. This was made possible by advances in super laser focusing and generator technology. It could punch through planetary shields and destroy entire cities or continents in an instant. The laser could obviously destroy enemy capital ships with one shot, although it was initially prone to breakdowns. Another issue was that it was difficult to aim the super laser because the vessel needed to be entirely aligned with the target. The Empire intended to use the Eclipse class alongside its sister ship class, the Sovereign, to consolidate its rule over the galaxy again. However, the construction of the Eclipse was delayed after the death of Palpatine at Endor. It eventually fell into the hands of the crime lord Tiber Zan, the leader of the Zan Consortium. He seized it in the aftermath of the chaos at Endor, but eventually abandoned it after destroying half an Imperial fleet with its super laser because the ship was unfinished. In 8.5 ABY, it left Quat for Biss, where initially it served as an orbital space station above the Imperial capital of Biss, as we see in the Dark Empire series. The Eclipse was a symbol of Imperial domination while also serving as a point of coordination for the Imperial Navy. Soon, the reborn Palpatine began his campaign against the New Republic and used the Eclipse as his flagship. It's fair to say that we never see the full potential of this vessel in Legends. Palpatine planned to use it against Mon Calamari, but Luke Skywalker destroyed his world devastators and disrupted the first stage of his plan. Eventually, the shop would be destroyed at Dasucha 5 after Luke and Leia redirected a Force storm toward the Eclipse, consuming the entire ship. Every Star Wars fan knows that the bad guys rarely learn from their mistakes. We've seen so many versions of the Death Star in canon and legends, from the original space station to Starkiller Base in the sequel trilogy and the Darksaber in Kevin J. Anderson's novel. The Eclipse II class Dreadnought was the second and only other Super Star Destroyer in this series to exist. In fairness, Luke and Leia destroyed the first one through unconventional means, so the Empire may have thought that there wasn't a problem with the ship design. According to Star Wars Empire's End, the Eclipse II was almost identical to the original ship. However, certain aspects, including the engine arrays, were redesigned, and they included a tower above the axial superlaser. Also, the Eclipse II was developed directly above BIS, not at quad drive yards like its sister ship. Otherwise, it had the same weapon systems, including the 500 heavy turbo laser batteries and 500 point defense laser cannons. It was equally fearsome in appearance, with that menacing jet black durasteel and quadranium alloyed hull. Even though it wasn't as powerful as a Death Star, it was far more mobile and still retained enough firepower to raise an entire world. The Eclipse II possessed 8 engines compared to its predecessor's 6. Unlike the original ship, they were clustered together like on other Star Destroyers. The Eclipse II had a relatively short and ignominious history after the destruction of its sister ship. It became the Emperor's new flagship. It transported him to the Sith tomb world of Korriban and eventually became the focal point of the Battle of Onderon. The New Republic desperately tried to capture the reborn Emperor to re-establish peace and order in the galaxy. Eventually, it was destroyed over BIS when R2-D2 took control of the Super Star Destroyer's computer banks. The little astromech set the gigantic ship on a collision course with the Galaxy Gun, the latest in the Empire's long line of superweapons. As it crashed into the Galaxy Gun, the superweapon ejected a projectile and was pulled toward the planet BIS below. The massive explosion resulted in the destruction of both the Eclipse II and the Galaxy Gun. Most notably, the Empire's Royal Guard suffered devastating losses with only a handful of survivors. Before moving on, it's clear that the Eclipse II made more sense than the Executor class because it wasn't just about shock and awe. It possessed superweapon capabilities while also operating as a mobile logistics hub, like a cross between the Mega-class Star Dreadnought and the Zeiston-class Star Destroyers in canon. Next up is the Sovereign-class Super Star Destroyer. This ship is fascinating for several reasons. Technically a Dreadnought, it's the only ship in this video with the term Super Star Destroyer in its official designation. Fortunately for the New Republic, the Empire never actually got around to completing these, despite the reborn Emperor Palpatine's best wishes. The Dark Empire sourcebook explains that he planned to make these vast ships the backbone of his next-generation fleet alongside the Eclipse class. Since they were slightly smaller than the Eclipse, the Empire believed that they would finish constructing their first Sovereign Star Destroyers first. However, they never completed even one of these staggering capital ships. It was strikingly similar to the Eclipse class because it also had an axial superlaser, albeit a smaller one. But the Sovereign sacrificed some carrying capacity and prestige in exchange for being somewhat more practical to build. At least that's what they planned in theory. The Eclipse wasn't simply a bigger Star Destroyer, it was essentially a mobile Imperial headquarters. Palpatine envisioned the Sovereign as the next generation of Star Dreadnought that could actually be fielded in multiple copies. Instead of building one impossibly expensive flagship, the Empire could deploy several Sovereigns across different fleets. The Dark Empire sourcebook explains that the Sovereign Super Star Destroyer would have 500 heavy laser cannons, 500 turbo laser batteries, and 75 ion cannons, as well as 5 gravity well projectors. It could host 35 TIE Interceptor squadrons and an additional 5 TIE Bomber squadrons. The Sovereign would carry 75 AT-ATs, so a few less than the larger Eclipse class. The ship was 15,000 meters long because this was the minimum space required to house the massive generators powering the axial superlaser. Ideally, it would have a maximum crew of 601,670 with a minimum complement of just over 80,000. Each Sovereign would boast a staggering 130,100 troops. The ship had a cargo capacity of 400,000 metric tons and carried enough consumables for 5 years. As I've emphasized, the Empire never managed to complete the construction of one of these ships, although it had several in production. The first was intended to be called the Sovereign. Others would have included the Despot, the Autarch, and the Heresiarch. They were still under construction at BIS by the time of Operation Shadowhand and the reborn Emperor's move against the New Republic. The Sovereign class and the Eclipse class were both still in development in 0 BBY, however the Rebel Alliance didn't learn of the existence of either class until they captured a copy of the Imperial Handbook after the Battle of Endor. General Carlos Riacan correctly surmised that they hadn't made progress on either design by this point. The Sovereign remains one of the most awesome ships that actually never existed. Now let's go back in time a bit with the Mandator I class Dreadnought. As the name suggests, it's the first of the Mandator series that culminated with Mandator IV, which Supreme Leader Snoke used as his flagship in the sequel series. There are slight discrepancies between canon and legends. Earlier descriptions of this ship in the complete Star Wars encyclopedia describe it as a warship developed by our old friends at Quat Drive Yards 2 decades before the Clone Wars. It replaced the Procurator-class Star Battlecruiser as the largest ship in the Republic fleet, and was the first starship to receive the designation of Dreadnought by the Anaxes War College. The Essential Guide to Warfare says that it was 8,000 meters long, which was massive for ships of this era. Is it a true Super Star Destroyer? No, but it's definitely a predecessor to some of the ships that emerged after. The Ruusan reformations limited the amount of firepower that a Mandator I class Dreadnought could carry. This was the restructuring of the Galactic Republic after the New Sith Wars in 1000 BBY that took power away from the Supreme Chancellor and reinvested it in the Galactic Senate. Palpatine would undo all of this during the Clone Wars. By the time of the Clone Wars, there were 7 of these Star Dreadnoughts in Republic service, with 3 in the Quat sector. While the Republic couldn't openly field massive offensive fleets, it still needed to protect critical infrastructure like the Quat Drive Yards. If war broke out, the Mandator would become the centerpiece of a Republic fleet, using its immense firepower and resilience to absorb enemy attacks, while smaller warships maneuvered around it. There are some deviations in canon sources. The Rogue One Rebel dossier describes the ship as a type of dreadnought in the naval forces of the Galactic Empire. They likely phased them out gradually after assimilating most of the Republic's military into their own forces. The Rebel dossier reveals that General Jan Dodonna sent a communication that surmised the capital ship would have to be at least the size of a Mandator-class dreadnought to carry a super laser. However, that laser still probably wouldn't be strong enough to destroy an entire planet. This assessment is actually consistent with the larger Eclipse-class and Sovereign-class Star Dreadnoughts in Legends. The Mandator-class Dreadnought entered canon in the role-playing game Lead by Example in 2016. It's a reminder that the Imperial fleet didn't just have Victory-class and Imperial-class Star Destroyers in its fleets. However, the Mandator wasn't optimized for carrying huge invasion armies, serving as a massive fighter carrier, or acting as a mobile command center, because only a few were built. Each acted much like a modern nuclear-powered capital ship. Its existence made potential attackers think twice before committing to an assault. The Mandator II Dreadnought was the next ship in this series of Super Star Destroyer adjacent ships. According to canon, they saw service during the Clone Wars, although we never see them on the big screen, and there's very limited concept art. The Star Wars Encyclopedia explains that they were much larger than the Venator-class Star Destroyer, the most iconic Republic capital ship of this era. Meanwhile, Star Wars Complete Vehicles says that over 1,000 recusant light destroyers were needed to challenge one Mandator II class Dreadnought. I'm willing to bet that one X-Wing pilot would find a way, but even so, that's a wild statistic. This huge ship was 8 kilometers long because of the hypermatter annihilation reactor equipment that it carried inside. The Complete Star Wars Encyclopedia says that Quat Drive Yards cut ties with the Techno Union before the Clone Wars and developed ships for Republic use only. They developed the Mandator II as an upgrade of the pre-war Mandator I, although they also retrofitted some of the older models. These heavy vessels served in the newly centralized Republic Navy during the Clone Wars. It was much larger and much more powerful than the iconic Venator class, also produced by Quat Drive, but there were far fewer. One of the main reasons for this was that they were much more expensive than the Venator. Also, like the Mandator I, they were intended primarily as system protection vessels rather than frontline capital ships. We see in the sequel trilogy that the role of the Mandator class would evolve with the creation of the Mandator IV. Unlike the dagger-like profiles of standard Star Destroyers, these ships had humpbacked shapes. The Mandator III class Dreadnought is one of the largest ships in Star Wars that we know almost nothing about. The name doesn't even exist in canon, even if it logically should be there. We have the Mandator I, II, and IV, but strangely there's no canon information about the third ship in this series. Luckily, Legends has a little bit more about this Super Star Destroyer adjacent ship. This one was a true behemoth at 12,000 meters, so it's much closer to what we consider to be an actual Super Star Destroyer. The Essential Guide to Warfare also explains that it had a different strategic role from its predecessors in the Mandator series. They designed it to be a hulking weapons platform, so it was more heavily armed and armored than the older versions. This brought it far closer to the siege dreadnought we see in The Last Jedi. The Emperor designed several heavy capital ships after the Executor class, including the Mandator III and the Bellator class. We know that some of these ships fought in the Imperial Civil War after the Battle of Endor. This was a period of infighting between the surviving Empire and various splinter groups that vied for power and control after the death of the Emperor. It lasted from 4 ABY to 12 ABY when Admiral Natasi Dalla executed 13 Imperial warlords and reunified Imperial forces, as we see in the novel Darksaber. In one battle, a Mandator III called the Panthak was destroyed in combat with the Whelm, an Executor-class Star Dreadnought, over the core world of Alsacan. The Whelm might be the worst-named Super Star Destroyer in any Star Wars story, and was also destroyed in the battle. The Bellator-class Dreadnought was an alternative design in the Mandator series of Star Dreadnoughts that served in the Imperial Navy. Manufactured by Quat Drive Yards, it was a huge beast at 7,200 meters. Remember, an Imperial Star Destroyer was only 1,600 meters long, so this was 4.5 times larger. It's not on the scale of some of the later Super Star Destroyers like the Eclipse class, but very few ships were. This was still an enormous vessel. The Essential Guide to Warfare claims that it was introduced by 3 ABY, and that it would remain in active service until 137 ABY. Quat Drive Yards designed the Bellator class to be more mobile than its predecessor in the Mandator series. It was 800 meters shorter than the Mandator I and II, while sacrificing some armaments to gain higher velocities. This also set it apart from the Mandator III series, which entered service around the same time. The Mandator III was intended to be more powerful and heavily armed, so the two ships complemented each other well. Nonetheless, the Bellator class was still a daunting prospect on the battlefield. The dorsal surface mounted a huge array of gun batteries, which made it a match for most Rebel and New Republic ships. This ship was one of the most beloved designs in Legends because it answered a question many fans have asked. What if the Empire designed a Super Star Destroyer that was actually practical? Yes, it was enormous, but it was way smaller than the 19-kilometer Executor class. This made it significantly easier to build, deploy, and maintain while still being capable of dominating almost any conventional fleet. Most Star Dreadnoughts are essentially floating fortresses, but the Bellator was a hunter. Quat Drive Yards created it to pursue enemy fleets, intercept enemy task forces, and rapidly reinforce threatened sectors. It had 14 mounted engines, which made it notably faster than most ships of its class. These ships had command towers similar to those on standard Star Destroyers like the Imperial class. There were several of these ships in service throughout galactic history. In the Essential Guide to Warfare, Admiral Ozzel and Captain Piet observe a gathering of Bellators before the Battle of Hoth. They also served as part of a fleet escort for the larger Assertor class Star Dreadnought, which had a more conventional role as a sector command and control ship. We know that the New Republic had no problem assimilating captured Imperial ships into its own navy. They operated at least one Bellator-class Star Dreadnought during the Thrawn campaigns, as well as a Pro-Crusader-class Star Destroyer. These ships were also active during the Dark Empire crisis, as we see in Dark Empire II. Its long, dagger-like ship gave it a very menacing appearance, so it's easy to see why it's so popular. The Assertor-class Star Dreadnought is exactly what most fans imagine when they hear the words Super Star Destroyer. According to the Essential Guide to Warfare, it was a staggering 15,000 meters long, with each unit costing a cool 1,100,000,000 credits. At least two of these ships were built before the Battle of Yavin, the lead ship Assertor and the Wrath. They served the Empire as command ships and heavily armed weapons platforms. The Assertor class also acted as sector command and control posts, with Mandator and Bellator dreadnoughts as escorts. At the time, it was considered the second largest of the Star Dreadnought line after the Executor class. The ship's hull was shaped like a long, thin arrowhead. There was a long, prominent ridge on top, from stern to bow, containing guns as well as the command bridge. The canon source, Starships and Speeders, reveals that each Assertor class had 40 quad-heavy turbo lasers, 30 quad-ion cannon batteries, and a bevy of other weapon systems. There were 60 turret-mounted quad-laser cannons and 10 twin-heavy turbo laser batteries, as well as various missile systems. Theoretically, this was enough firepower to destroy an entire planet. They could carry up to 120 starfighters, and a range of other vessels, including starfighters, assault ships, gunboats, and shuttles. These ships featured command and control systems, providing commanders with a near unparalleled view of the battlefield. They were equipped with Class II hyperdrives and enough consumables for 3 years without resupply. The sourcebook Lead by Example explains that the Empire deployed its 2 known Assertors in battle groups on the border between the Mid and Outer Rim territories. There isn't much information about the operations of these vessels, but the Essential Guide to Warfare confirms that the Wrath led at least one Base Delta Zero operation during its career. Base Delta Zero was the Imperial Code order to destroy all population centers and resources, including industry, natural resources, and cities. The phrase was first introduced in Star Wars Legends in 1989, but became canon in the Star Wars Rebels series when Lothal faced this potential fate. Sabine Wren even mentioned and condemned the Base Delta Zero initiative in her private journal. We don't know the specific planet that the Wrath targeted, but we can assume that it suffered a violent fate. There is no evidence about what happened to either Wrath or the Assertor in either continuity. The Vengeance-class Dreadnought entered Imperial service after 4 ABY. There's limited information about this massive ship, but it appears as the flagship of Imperial Inquisitor Jarek in Star Wars Jedi Knight Dark Forces II. It was based on the Executor class and was similarly huge in scale at 19,000 meters long. This even led to some classifications describing it as a space station. Manufactured by Kuat Drive Yards, this ship had some very distinct characteristics. One of the main differences between the Executor class and the Vengeance was the shape of its profile. The Vengeance was much narrower than standard Star Destroyer designs. It was more rapier-like in silhouette, rather than the wedge-shaped dagger of other models. The Vengeance was also 150 meters tall, with downward-sloping armor dominating most of its frame. Fascinatingly, it lacked the standard Star Destroyer bridge tower, one of the most notorious exposed points of these ships. Instead, the command bridge was located on a small square ridge near the stern of the ship. This was a trait it shared with the Praetor Mark II class battlecruiser. We don't know much about its armaments except that it had more than enough power to easily defeat a Corellian corvette. Its weapon systems and starfighter complement were probably similar to an Executor class Super Star Destroyer. The BIS Defense Fleet operated several Vengeance class dreadnoughts. 3 were sent from the Deep Core to reconquer the core worlds in 10 ABY. Technically, this ship only exists in Legends, but a variant almost made it into canon. Concept art for Episode 9 shows an unused command ship designed for Kylo Ren that greatly resembles the Vengeance. The Megador is one of the most mysterious and polarizing Super Star Destroyers in the Legends continuity. All we know from the Essential Guide to Warfare is that it was a Star Dreadnought, but there's no specific information about which class. It was somewhere between 5,000 and 19,000 meters in length and possessed devastating firepower. This ship features in the Legacy of the Force series, where we learn that its 3 long-range turbo laser batteries had the combined total firepower of 5 Imp Star Deuces. It also had at least 51 hangar bays, so it likely had a vast starfighter complement. This ship had an observation deck with a dome so that its commanders could observe their surroundings during fleet maneuvers. It served as the flagship of Supreme Chancellor Palaeon during the Dark Nest Crisis and the Swarm War as he took command of the Galactic Alliance Defense Forces. This was ironic because Palaeon had uncovered the Megador and another Star Dreadnought, the Dominion, at Deep 3, one of Blitzer Harsk's shipyards. He proceeded to use these ships against the New Republic until the Imperial Remnant finally signed a peace treaty in 19 ABY. The Megador was still in service in 44 ABY after the Battle of Coruscant in the Fate of the Jedi series. Popular fan theories include that it was a Mandator III because of its emphasis on long-range gunnery and heavy combat, or that it was an Executor class because of its role as a command ship. It also is entirely possible that it was its own separate class of ship as a one-off prototype. The reality is that we have no way of knowing, but it was definitely a Super Star Destroyer. Finally, I want to wrap this video up with an honorable mention. The Viscount class Star Defender. Obviously, when we talk about Super Star Destroyers, we're not thinking about Mon Calamari cruisers, but the Viscount class deserves to be in the conversation because it was essentially the New Republic's answer to these massive ships. The Viscount class was a fixture in the New Jedi Order series as the New Republic battled the extragalactic threat of the Yuuzhan Vong and their biotechnology. According to Starships of the Galaxy, Admiral Ackbar led the production of Viscount-class Star Defenders after the Battle of Endor. Despite having defeated the Executor at this key battle, Ackbar recognized the remaining Imperial Super Star Destroyers as a massive threat to the New Republic Navy. That's why he proposed the creation of warships that were equal in scale to the Executor-class Star Dreadnoughts. However, the New Republic was reluctant to sanction such massive vessels, and it took years before the project finally moved forward. Finally, after a lengthy development period and the threat of the rogue Executor-class Star Dreadnought Intimidator during the Black Fleet crisis, the Mon Calamari began designing these enormous capital ships. However, progress was still slow as the Imperial Remnant represented an increasingly diminished threat. The Republic also captured several Super Star Destroyers throughout its long campaigns against the Imperial warlords, including Lusankya, as I mentioned earlier. Starships of the Galaxy explains that they commissioned the first ship of its class, a smaller prototype battlecruiser named the Viscount in 25 ABY. It was predominantly used against Imperial warlords and had at least one recorded battle with an Executor-class Star Dreadnought. Eventually, they began to release the full-scale Star Defenders, including the Calamari Viscounts and another variation, the Corellian Strident class. All of these vessels saw extensive service against the Yuuzhan Vong as the galaxy erupted into a war for its very survival. After this widespread conflict, the Star Defenders became the backbone of the Galactic Alliance Defense Force. One of the most iconic Star Defenders was the Bounty, which held off the Yuuzhan Vong from attacking Mon Calamari for years. These vessels proved critical during the eventual battle for the planet. The Viscount fought alongside another Star Defender called the Harbinger and an Executor-class Star Dreadnought, the Guardian, in defense of the world. Their heavy, long-range weapons were essential in destroying the center of the Yuuzhan Vong armada. This was critical for the New Republic because the Mon Calamari shipyards were the backbone of their military infrastructure. Eventually, by the time of the Sith Imperial Wars 100 years later, heavy cruisers and dreadnoughts became increasingly phased out as fleet doctrine moved towards lighter platforms. The MC-140 Scythe-class main battlecruiser was a good example of this. I've included the Viscount-class Star Defender in this video because even though it's not a true Super Star Destroyer, it's definitely one of the very few ships that's in the same class. The original prototype Viscount was only 3 kilometers long, but the full-scale production model was a staggering 17 kilometers. This left is slightly shorter than the Executor class, but the overall design enabled it to carry more starfighters with a significantly smaller crew complement. Another benefit was its more durable and extensive armor. Meanwhile, similarly to the Mega class, it had dozens of docking clamps that allowed it to directly dock with many other capital ships. According to Starship's Battle Preview 1, it had 2,000 heavy turbo lasers, another 2,000 standard turbo lasers, and 200 assault concussion missile tubes. Other weapon systems included 300 heavy ion cannons, 500 point defense laser cannons, as well as 40 tractor beam projectors. The Viscount was also a true starship carrier in the mold of the old Clone Wars Venator-class Star Destroyer. It could carry 168 regular and 48 heavy starfighters. A typical complement included 72 X-Wings, 48 A-Wing interceptors, and 48 bombers such as B-Wings or K-Wings. They also carried 48 E-Wing escort starfighters, as well as between 84 and 1,000 additional support ships like shuttles, dropships, and landing barges. These vessels were true behemoths with a standard crew capacity of 68,174, while they also had room for up to 200,000 refugees. This was crucial during the Yuuzhan Vong War when the invaders were devastating entire worlds. Again, I fully admit that it's not a true Super Star Destroyer, but it's definitely an adjacent ship. This was the New Republic's answer to these monstrous ships. Which do you think was the most effective? Let me know in the comments below.